Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to those of you who are joining us from across the world today for another edition of Pandemic Punditries, brought to you by the Content Experience Company. We are delighted and honored to have with us Katherine Knapke, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute and the host of our very own podcast, Ask with Confidence. Katherine is also a registered psychiatric nurse practitioner and a mediator. Welcome to Pandemic Punditry, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, we're glad you're here and to lend a different perspective to negotiations. We've had a couple of sessions with others, but I think we're going to have a refreshingly different perspective on a very, very important subject today. So we're looking forward to our conversation today. So to just kick things off, I was wondering whether, Katherine, we could, whether I could assume, for example, that men and women have different sort of strengths and weaknesses that they bring to the negotiating table. And can you describe some strengths that women in general possess when it comes to negotiation? And once you answered that, maybe you can answer with some of the weaknesses they also bring to the negotiating table.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we focus on the strengths that women have, because I think often in the negotiation space, the weaknesses are really highlighted just because women aren't showing up in those spaces. So often the weaknesses are what get portrayed, and then women end up feeling like, well, I can't do this, so what's the point? But women actually have a lot of strengths in the negotiation space, and it actually makes us better and often stronger at negotiating. So a lot of the strengths that we do have, listening, empathy, joint problem solving. Those are all really important skills. And I know that Kwame, who's the director of the American Negotiation Institute, he was on here and he does the compassionate curiosity framework, which gives you a really nice step-by-step framework of how to have those difficult conversations. But if you go through that framework and you look at those steps, the first step, which lists I'm blanking on what the first step of this framework is. Kwame is going to hate me. The first step, it involves listening, and now I am completely blanking on the first step of the compassionate curiosity framework. This is so embarrassing, but it's all about listening with empathy and understanding, and women do better at coming from a place of empathy and being able to do that compassionately and asking those questions. Whereas men, they've done studies, they gave women testosterone. There was a study done on this. Women became unable to do that joint problem solving. So women have really good strengths in those areas of being able to do things compassionately and empathetically.
Karthika?
Thanks, Lali. Hi, Katherine. Thanks for joining us today. So before I get started, I want to tell you an incident that happened to a friend of mine, right? So she was in a higher position than a male, and they were both negotiating their salaries, and he got the raise and she didn't. And the answer that she got when she queried was that she didn't have a family to support, in that her husband was supporting the family, that she didn't have to, but whereas the man had a family to support and as such deserved the raise, right? So my question is, and Kwame touched upon this a little bit as well, is that, so a lot of people that I've been reading up on, they say that when women go into negotiation, they should take a more communal approach to talking about, why they deserve the raise. Could you explain to us what that means? It sounds so unfair to me just hearing about it. So just tell me what that means, please.
Yeah, so there are a couple ways to look at this, and yes, it is unfair. And the movement is going, in all of the studies and work being done, is looking at what are the structures in place and how can these structures actually improve, so that way when women are negotiating in the spaces, that we're more successful. Because it shouldn't be that the women need to change what they're doing to become more like men, because we're not men. Our negotiating techniques are not male techniques. And we shouldn't need to completely adjust what we're doing in order to become like men, because it doesn't work when we do it that way. And so what a communal approach is in that joint problem solving space, and looking at things of like, how does it improve things for everybody? Whereas for men, they can just do it as, what would make me more successful? Whereas women need to do it more from a joint aspect of how does it benefit everybody. They're also able to more effectively negotiate if they're negotiating on behalf of advocacy. So women are really good, like if you think of like the mama bear stereotype, women are fierce when they're advocating on behalf of somebody else. So if they're approaching it from that perspective, they typically tend to do better in that area. It's not fair, but they do see statistically that they are more successful if they approach it from that angle.
So they should think of themselves, they should represent themselves as though they're representing somebody else.
Yes, and again, I'm hesitant to say like, hey, women need to do X, Y, and Z, because it doesn't always work that way. And again, it's not fair. Women are we are behind. So I always put a disclaimer on it. And in the case of your friend, it's not fair. And likely and statistically, women are the ones who are expected to take care of their families. So just because she doesn't have a family now, she probably would in the future, and she will probably be looked at as somebody who would likely have a family in the future. And then the woman is expected to take care of that family in the future. So there is a book called The Invisible Woman, and it looks at like all the invisible work that women do on top of the demands of everyday life. So women aren't getting paid for childcare, but yet they're expected to, do their regular job and take care of the child on top of that. So just because, the male had the family already doesn't mean that the woman doesn't have those expectations placed upon her. I mean, if you think about when a woman gets pregnant, the other women around her are expected to do things like, at least here in the US, it's women that go to baby showers and women that get all the comments of like, when are you going to be next kind of thing. And if a woman doesn't want to have kids, then a lot of times it's frowned upon. So it's a double-edged sword.
So interesting. I want to just sort of dig a little deeper into this kind of problem that Karthika sort of articulated, and then you've sort of discussed as well, which is I think that it seems that when women assert themselves, the perception generally, because of gender stereotypes and biases, is that they are aggressive, right? So I think that's sort of the research, I think, substantiates this quite well. In fact, as you've so rightly mentioned, it's sometimes that bias actually comes from women themselves. I think there's a study that was done where both groups of men and women, when a woman sort of asks for something, is sort of labeled as being, she's being aggressive, right? So this is like a kind of a very sort of hard situation. I think that's what both of you seem to be struggling with, is how do you kind of not pander to the bias, but still get what you want and what you deserve, right? So I think what is that fine line, and how do women, and what advice do you give women to sort of straddle that line? Because it seems that no matter how they sort of ask, you're going to come across this sort of brick wall of bias and prejudice and stereotypes. So what's the right way to do that, or is there not a right way and you just battle your way through? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So there's not like, there's no playbook out there that I could give and like, hey, this is specifically for women, and if you follow this step by step, you're going to be successful. Because like you said, there are biases, and sometimes you will come across really great allies out there who will be like, yes, I understand you and I get you, and that is fantastic. And we love all of those people. And sometimes you will come across some men who just, you're going to butt heads with, and it's going to be a struggle. And so, again, disclaimers, and there's no easy way to approach this, and it really should be the structures that we need to adjust that really need to be supporting women to meet us where we're at. But for where we are now, my approach and what I do recommend is like a case-by-case basis. So play to your strengths and what you can do, and then look at who you are talking with in each negotiation, what their personality is, and play to what those are. How do you persuade that person individually? What is persuasive to them? And go from there. So I had a conversation with one of my friends who was having an argument with their significant other and kept hitting a wall with them. And I told them, you know what, maybe at this point, what you're doing right now isn't working. So change what you're saying in a language that they can understand. And their response to me was, well, I don't want this to be a game. I don't want it to be like an eye for an eye. And I'm like, it's not a game. Just like you would with a 5-year-old child. And I'm not saying like, as women, we're talking to 5-year-old men. I'm not calling men 5-year-olds, but just as you would with a child, when you adjust your language, like I'm not going to tell a child and use like huge words when I'm trying to explain a concept to them, because they're not going to understand. So if you are trying to persuade somebody and it's not working, and I would do the same with another woman, if it's not working, change what you're saying in a way that they can hear you, in a way that is persuasive. So I'll use Kwame as an example. He's competitive and he likes things that are efficient. And so sometimes if I'm not getting through to him, I will change what I'm saying in a way that persuades him competitively. So if there's some way that I know that he's going to want to win, how is this going to help him get ahead? And that usually persuades him to change his approach and helps him understand where I'm coming from. So just like you would there, how can you change what you're saying in a way that they can understand? So it's not a game and it's not manipulative or rude. It's just changing your language.
Okay.
Katherine?
Yeah, thanks, Katherine. So your podcast is called Ask with Confidence, right? And part of the problem is women don't see inherent value in what we do. Like we don't see ourselves and in the same way that men see themselves, right? So how can we ask with confidence? And because you are what you believe you are, right? Because if you believe that you deserve the race, then more often than not, despite all like negotiation tactics, you probably will get the race. Part of it is we don't believe it. So how do we ask with confidence?
Yeah. So I'm gonna give the answer. Practice makes perfect. And I know it's hard to say. Just be confident. So my background is not in negotiation. I came from a family that doesn't negotiate. And the very first episode on my podcast gives a background. My parents never negotiated. They're all conflict avoidant. My family is still very conflict avoidant. And my job makes them very uncomfortable, that I am now more willing to confront rather than avoid when there are disagreements. And a lot of it is repetition. And I had to get very uncomfortable many, many times. And sometimes I still get very uncomfortable when there is a conflict that comes up. So it's practice and repetition. And we do have the guides on our website for practicing before you go into negotiation. There are studies that show when you are intentional with your preparation and with your practice, that it does help you improve and feel better going into something. So it'd be the same as if you're playing piano or trying to ride a bike, you're not just going to be perfect at it the first time you do it, but you have to keep practicing until you get better. And then you become, Mozart, who probably doesn't feel nervous when going into a concert to play piano. So a lot of repetitions to get there. The other thing to do is, find people that are in your corner. So maybe there is somebody that you are talking to that doesn't support you, but I'm sure there are people around you that do have your back and can give you some tips and techniques of, what would be supportive. And if it doesn't work, have them come with you or figure out how to have a conversation in order for that to happen. So maybe you need to have a team meeting. Sometimes you aren't the right person to have the conversation, depending on what it is. And sometimes it's a no. So, getting rejected and having fails, it's just all part of the practice and showing up in that space.
So, if I was I'm just sort of listening to sort of what both of you are sort of saying a little bit here, and I'm trying to see, and some of the points you made earlier, and I'm just wondering, given the strengths that women bring in comparison to men, for example, active listening, empathy, joint problem solving, a whole host of other things, right, that women are great at. And in sort of my understanding of the process of negotiation, the initial, creating of relationships, trust building, value creation, all of that lends itself, easier to women to do than men. Men don't inherently have those skills. They want to jump in and do the ask first and foremost, right? Without any of that kind of building that's really crucial today, because I think the environment of negotiations in the corporate world, or even in a non-corporate environment, has changed substantially. People are more into a team collaborative sort of environment where people are, you're not only just dealing with your boss, you're dealing with a whole bunch of other people. So I think women may have more strengths than they give themselves credit for. And maybe that's something that, they need to leverage and work on. But the thing that maybe they're not as comfortable doing is the ask. And I've, personally experienced this with, the women. They seem to be, we are happy to go and ask some outrageous number, knowing that we'll be shot down, but it doesn't, we don't take that personally maybe, and we don't feel diminished by that. And maybe women are a lot more sort of, conservative about that. They're like, we have to be fair, and all of these other sort of stuff comes in. And I think you gave a tip once in one of your podcasts where you say, ask for 5% more than the number you've come up with, right? So is this ask with confidence? And I'm sort of, wondering why you picked that as your podcast title. So is this really about getting to that final step that you feel women are not doing a great job at, which is the ask part? Is that where you think more work needs to happen in terms of practice and, skilling and all of that when it comes to negotiation?
I think a lot of it is giving women just the confidence to show up in whatever space they need to show up. Women are statistically behind, and the pandemic has put us behind even more. So, it doesn't need to be necessarily asking for a salary raise or, asking for whatever, but just giving women the tools and techniques that they need to reassure them that they are worthy and they do have value, and what they say matters. It can be as much as, in a meeting, having the confidence to say your piece, and feeling comfortable enough to voice your idea. I was watching something about I think it was a TikTok. I don't have TikTok, but it was a news article about a girl who was filming herself in class, and she's in a STEM major. So she's one of the only girls in a engineering class, maybe. And she would give an idea and nothing. And then men would take her idea and they'd get all the credit for it, even though she literally just said it. I know, it's infuriating. So what the goal of the podcast is to give women the tools that they need to be heard and to feel that they can voice their opinion, whether it's, changing your language to be more persuasive, not that you should need to, but recognizing that you do have strengths, because the language is so heavily geared to knock women down some pegs, and when you first asked me, your first question was wondering what the strengths of women and what our weaknesses were. And if you realized, I didn't say what any of our weaknesses were, because I think we all know what the weaknesses are because they're so heavily, they're highlighted all the time. And it's not necessarily that they are our weaknesses. I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree that women have any more weaknesses than men. And in fact, I think we actually have more strengths. I think there's a study that showed that women's brains make more connections, and I can't remember the number, but our brains make more connections than men, which if you're problem solving, we think more. And we can think outside the box more. It helps us be creative more. So there are tons of strengths that just aren't getting used. So it'd be valuable for men to have women in the rooms and problem solving with us and listening to us, where just as with women, it's valuable for us to be listening to men. So it should be, an equal partnership, but it's not. So with the podcast, it's just highlighting, I want you to recognize that you have the strengths. And the podcast itself, it came out of, it was born because Kwame's podcast, even though he does a great job of highlighting both men and women, and his podcast is Negotiate Anything, fantastic. He got some comments that it sounded like a men's club, which sometimes just because it's coming from a male host, even though it has both men and women, the information can't be heard because of who it's coming from. So the podcast is there so that way everybody can hear the information and recognize, there are people out there highlighting this information for women, and women do have strengths.
Kathika?
Yeah, listening to you, Catherine, I'm reminded of something I read somewhere recently, and I'm sure this will resonate with you as well, is that this person had said, women have always worked. We're only now just starting to get paid for it, right? And I feel like part of maybe the sort of, what's the word? Maybe vulnerability that we have is because we're used to working without credit. We're not used to asking for credit and, being able to have our own voice in a way that it is heard. And yes, of course, there are always going to be men who talk over us and all of that stuff, right? So we all face that. But I think part of it is also because we're so used to doing work without people noticing it, we stop noticing the work that we do too. Right? So how can we break that, right? Because if you're a mom and you're at home and you're also working, how do you switch gears? Because you're doing all of this work at home, which nobody really notices. And then you go to office and you need to now start taking credit for things that you're doing. So how do you walk that balance?
Yeah. There was actually a podcast episode that I did on this with Sarah Lashiver, who is one of the co-authors of the book Women Don't Ask. Excellent book if anybody reads that or has read it. And she pointed out, and I can't believe I didn't recognize this before, but the way that we are raising our children has a lot to do with how women and men are in the spaces as we grow up. So men are, as young boys, are given activities such as like mowing the lawn or chores outside. The toys that they're given are things like tools and different activities like that, where they're building and activities that they would be paid for. So outdoor lawn care is typically a paid service, and then they can go door to door and they're getting that experience of how to ask and set a price at an early age. Whereas women, as young girls, are typically doing activities in the home. So, cooking, cleaning, like unloading the dishwasher. And then it's not until later on in life, as when you get older, that women are also doing babysitting. So again, it's that like mothering care job, things that you're not getting paid for, babysitting, yes, you are getting paid for, but you've already missed out on a whole bunch of years where you're not negotiating or asking, like getting paid for positions. So by the time that a girl is old enough to babysit, she doesn't know how to negotiate. I remember when I started babysitting and asking for price, I don't know. I just say, whatever you want to pay me is good. I didn't have any of the experience. And again, the house that I grew up in, you just didn't do that. So the way that we're raising our children has a lot to do with that. And we continue to perpetuate those because, that's what the toys are. And it continues a cycle with the spaces that in our homes, women are the moms and the parents and dads are the breadwinners and things like that. So it's just this never ending cycle of men make the money and women stay at home and have the invisible work. It's hard to break something that you've been doing forever. It's hard. A lot of it has to do with redirecting behavior and reminding like, hey, husband, I need you to do this chore. Like, can you unload the dishwasher? I'm not going to be doing it anymore, and setting some really firm boundaries. And that is hard to do when you have had this habit for however many years, because that's the way it's always been. It's going to be hard to redirect and reshape that behavior. In the workplace, you'll see that men often talk about their accomplishments and they're heard more often, whereas women, like that's their water cooler talk, whereas women in the workplace are often talking about like their home life and who their kids are. So their work accomplishments don't get talked about as much. And women tend to be more protective of when they have accomplished more. So we're not as friendly in those spaces of like work accomplishments and getting ahead because we have to work so hard to get ahead that we tend to be more competitive in those spaces. So our water cooler talk is more about our home life and is softer in that area. So men are getting recognized because their talk is about like, hey, congratulations, I heard about that, promotion or whatever you got. And I heard about, how you brought in however much money for that commission, XYZ. And that gets recognized, that gets passed around, that gets heard by upper management. They get ahead that way and they keep moving ahead because that continues to be their conversation. And women don't do that. So they get left behind because they're forgotten about. And it's not necessarily that, it's intentional, like, oh, I don't like women. Like management isn't thinking, oh, I don't like Katherine. Like, oh, she's a woman, so I'm not going to promote her. It's just because women aren't talking about it. So it's not at the forefront of management's brain.
Very interesting. I mean, so would you change any of this advice? I mean, have you seen, maybe in the research that you've done and in your experience, have you seen any differences when the person sitting across the table happens to be a woman and you're also a woman? And, does the dynamic then of negotiation change when two women are trying to negotiate? Or do they sort of adopt similar behaviors? I'm just curious. I mean, I'm hoping more of those negotiations happen now that women are climbing up and breaking glass ceilings. But it may be a rare occurrence. But have you seen any differences when two women sit together to negotiate?
So if you have like a group of women in a room, the conversation is pretty equal. Whereas like if you have one woman in a room of men, the woman speaks much less frequently than the men do. If the female is a manager, the data still shows that, the men in the workplace still get promoted more often, still because they are the one at the forefront of the manager's brain. Women can still go in, like if they have a one-on-one, they can still have those negotiations, but oftentimes, it's for promotions, it's, whoever is at the forefront of the brain and who's the one that is being heard most often. And oftentimes that's the male. It's not because it's, a female in the space. More often than not, having a female manager would make it easier for females to get ahead just because a lot of times women think about this kind of thing, like, hey, it's hard for me to get in this space. Let me help some other women out and try to be more equitable that way. But not necessarily, because often the people that get promoted are the ones that are heard of the most often when you think about the accomplishments, because you want to promote who's going to be successful and who's going to make the company successful. And not just because, like, let me promote this woman because she's a woman. You want to make sure that you're promoting who's going to be successful. And oftentimes the ones that you're hearing about are the men. And the study that, like, Sarah Lashover in her book and Linda Babcock, what they were finding, the women were still falling behind in their groups, just because the men were the ones coming to them and asking. So it wasn't intentional that they were doing anything. It's just, it's not who was asking or who they were thinking about.
Kalika?
Thanks, Bhave. You recently wrote an article, Katherine, on how women should negotiate, and you talked about things like posture, the need to smile, paying attention to tonality and word choice. So, are you concerned that by advising women to work within the bounds of sort of society, that you're reinforcing some of the same stereotypes and biases that are holding women back to begin with?
Yeah, like I said, it's a double-edged sword. It's, a darned if you do and a darned if you don't. So, I mean, if you don't, you get the labeled as aggressive or, bitchy. Then you're going to be hindered when you're trying to actually make some positive change. And so my recommendation is always, play to what is needed, not like a manipulative way. So I don't like the word play, but like personalize it. So, me talking to XYZ, if it makes it uncomfortable for me to be as I am in this space, and what is needed is for me to smile, if that is going to open the conversation for them to feel comfortable, then later down the line, when I am able to adjust my, have a more open personality and build that trust, then you can start moving the needle forward in a way that is more favorable to women in those conversations. So, start with where things are at and grow from there.
You have a follow-up for that, Katika, or you want me to ask a question? Okay. I think you're on mute, but I heard you. Okay. So Katherine, I'm just wondering, I'm sitting back here and thinking, given the sort of massive sort of societal change and sort of awakening to sort of this problem that is required, it's a general sort of, set of biases that, that are there. Negotiating is, or the challenges of negotiation is one of those challenges of the workplace that you find from all of these stereotypes and prejudices and biases. So does it warrant, you think, in your opinion, that you come up with a brand new sort of negotiation framework by women for women, where it plays to some of the, and maybe, I mean, I'm just wondering whether, you sort of throw out all the old playbooks and write a brand new one, which really talks to the strength of women, and maybe that's what's needed, as opposed to sort of trying to butt your head through this. And maybe you throw all the playbooks and you just barrel through and say, you know what, get used to it. I don't know. I mean, is this something that men have to sort of slapped around a little bit and said, wake up? It's no longer like 19th century. We're here, we're in the workplace, we're contributing, and you shall hear me. I mean, I'm just wondering. I'm sitting here as a male myself and figuring out what would my response be to something like that as well.
I've thought about that. The issue is that everybody is kind of different. So what is going to work in one area is not going to work in the other. Culturally, it's different. Personality-wise, it's different. So not everything works I think it could provide some value if there was something written by women for women that would be received better by women. So that way the tools could be used, because there is something to be said about being in the space to receive the tools in order to be able to use them. It doesn't matter if you shout all the tools in the world and give them all the techniques if they're not going to be open to it. They're not going to be able to hear it. So there is something to be said about that. But on the flip side of that, some of the same tools that work in the negotiation space are not gender specific. A lot of it just has to do with your own techniques. So even though it's written by men, sometimes those tools don't work for men either. It has to do with having a bunch of tools in your tool belt, and which one is going to work the best in which situation, and understanding, what are the specific tweaks that I can make in this situation, what is going to be most strategic and what is going to be most persuasive. Excuse me. And a lot of that has to do with personality style, situation, preparation, etc. And so it's very situational and very personalized. And so you want to be personalizing and customizing everything for every situation. So it's very hard to just say, yes, there's just one specific gender, whatever, but then you're going to lose a whole bunch of men to that. And you don't want to lose the men either on this. So I hesitate to just write something that is, 100% for women, but I do see the value in providing women with something that they can hear.
Thanks, Katherine. This is just my personal opinion. I don't know whether you've noticed this when you work with your clients as well. I find if in the room that I'm negotiating, even if it's all male, if it's a diverse set of males, it's easier for me. I find it easier to negotiate and just be myself, as opposed to if they all look the same or behave the same. Or does that make sense?
When there's diversity, I think it brings a whole different dynamic. And so then there are everybody is more aware when there is diversity, and it's easier to find a place if everybody is different and recognizing that there's difference. When it's a room of, everybody is the same and then there's just one person different, it creates a bigger shift. It makes it harder to get into the in crowd. Whereas, with everybody different, there is no real in crowd. You're all in the in crowd. And so then, everybody's just human. And so, yeah, I do recognize that when there's more diversity, and I think the studies have also shown that, but I can't speak to that. When there is more diversity, it is easier to speak just because, you're not forming the pods of with it's, everybody's just human.
Okay, thanks. Lavi, do you have a question?
Yeah, that was a great observation. I think, I think there's a sort of a cultural element as well. I think, right? So I know that when I moved to the U.S. and lived there for a while, I found these conversations really hard. I was brought up with the ethos that you do a great job, and people will recognize that great job and reward it accordingly. And, that was the worst piece of advice I ever got. But, because, I never talked my own, accomplishments up. And frankly, I thought it was self-evident to everybody around me. And I was looking around and I saw all these people sort of, getting ahead. And, I was always wondering, why was that the case? Had they forgotten all these things I had done? But I think it's asking with confidence and having done the research and sort of continuously marketing yourself seems to be something that I think certainly in America, it's the only country I can speak with some authority on, seems like a necessary part of your job, right? Whether you're male or female for that matter. At least, this water cooler conversation was a revealing thing, right? I mean, you're right. I think men tend to start talking about all kinds of things and women may talk about something completely different. So I think that these things are all sort of crucial, incremental things that sort of add up. And I'm wondering whether, some of the our audience is for our global. I'm wondering whether some of these techniques, work across cultures, right? Because I think, as you said, everything is sort of personal, everything is sort of individualized, and I think some cultures have a very different approach to into having difficult conversations, right? Because I know in Asian cultures, you don't want to create a conversation, have a conversation where the other person loses face, right? So you don't want to sort of directly sort of challenge somebody and say you're wrong, right? Or I need this, right? You're supposed to sort of play that game a little bit more. So I think you're right. I think these rules are there, but they have to be sort of personalized and contextualized and put in situation and in location. So that's what makes, I guess, this conversation on advice a little harder to do, because unless you have very specific scenarios, your advice is sort of generic in nature and maybe not very targeted at what somebody is probably going through. So
definitely. I mean, culturally, there are huge differences in gender. I know, like, women, like, my freedoms as a woman in the US are not the same freedoms in other countries. So some of the things that I could suggest doing here as like tools and techniques are not even possibilities or options of things that women could do in a different country. And so wanting to be very mindful of those things, because, it would be useless somewhere else. But there are still things that you can do personalized, and things that you can do that would give you confidence to feel okay as a woman in those spaces, recognizing, these are the things that I can do, and these are the things that bring me value, and recognize that I am a person of value and my voice has worth. For me, one of the things that we've had to do, so when I started working with the American Negotiation Institute, and I still have to work to be, a valued person, even in my role as a chief operating officer. But back in the beginning, it took a ton of effort just to get people to speak with me. A lot of them would dismiss me and say, no, I'm only going to speak with Kwame. So it took a lot of work to get people on board with, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to speak with me first before you get the chance to speak with Kwame. And it's setting those boundaries. And even in meetings with Kwame, recognizing where my strengths are. I'm not somebody that, I'm an introvert, so I don't like to talk a lot. I like to process. So we have it set up where, if I'm in a meeting with Kwame or one of our other team members, they will do more talking. And it's not necessarily that I'm being talked over, but I've just recognized where my strengths are. So I hear things that they don't catch. And I still feel valued in those ways. So things like that could be useful somewhere else. Maybe women in a different country don't necessarily have the space to speak up or be somebody in a position of leadership. But what are the strengths that they do have? Where are the places that they do have control? And where are the boundaries that they can set that give them that control and give them the value?
Thanks, Lavi. Thanks, Katherine. So, Katherine, for women to have an impact, they obviously we need to be taken seriously, right? So we need to negotiate and resolve conflict effectively for that to happen. So if there was one skill or technique you would recommend that women learn and put into practice, what would that be?
Cool. I mean, I would always recommend to prepare. I'm always going to say prepare. But if we're talking specifically in negotiation, the key skill that I would recommend is always to anchor. I did say, always anchor, 5% more than what you would ask for, just because you want to expect the other person to counter and not give you 100% of what you want. And also because you are setting the expectation and the baseline of where you're at. And if people will see you, if that's your first meeting, or if, you've never spoken with this person before, the expectation that you're setting, if you don't anchor or if you don't negotiate, is that you're a person that doesn't negotiate and that you can be pushed over. So I always want to come in with an anchor and set a boundary early on that, hey, I'm not somebody that is just going to be a doormat and somebody to be walked over. that I do have a voice, I do set boundaries, and I am going to negotiate with you and ask for what I want. So the key skill that I would say is, know what the number that you want, and then ask for 5% more with the expectation you might not get the 5% more, but at least you'll get closer to it.
So I learned something recently. Actually, it's thanks to Lavi. I was just in the process of wrapping up one of my work-related contracts, and he told me to make a list of everything that I'd ever done, and assign a dollar value to it, right? And it was crazy the amount of days it took me to come up with that list, purely because I'd taken myself for granted in all of the things that I was doing. And every time I used to talk to him and he used to ask me a question, it prompted me to say, oh, I forgot to put like 3 other things that I did down, But it really helped me to face that situation with confidence, because I knew like it wasn't just a feeling or an emotion, like there was concrete facts and data behind what I was saying. And that really helped me.
That's awesome, for one. But yeah, that goes to like the invisible work that women do, is that, we've been trained to do additional things. And so, I would recommend to anybody else listening to this, make that list, and same as how do you pronounce your name? I should have asked that earlier. Is it Karthi?
Call me Karthi.
Karthi? Okay. Yeah. I'm very sensitive to pronouncing names correctly. But yeah, make the list just like Karthi, and assign a value to it, similar to, if somebody were to have a job like that, how much would they have actually made? And you'll probably be surprised at how much the value.
I was surprised.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure you missed a couple still.
I'm pretty sure I
knowing you. But I think it's a good exercise for everybody to at some point in their life take stock of what they've done. Not to negotiate necessarily, but to actually sort of take a accounting of sort of what you've done. And I think we do end up doing so many different things, we don't keep track of everything. So and sometimes you could surprise yourself, especially in a moment where you're feeling a little beaten up or feeling down on yourself, and you pull out this list and you say, wow, okay, I have done quite a lot, so maybe I deserve that break, and maybe taking a day or two off is not the end of the world, and probably necessary. So I think we're going to have a guest I think later this week about unhustle, right? Because I think we grow up in this sort of environment that everybody feels like you got to work 24/7, and this work ethic is sort of it has to be a visible sort of toiling at the this stuff is medieval, right? You don't need to do that anymore, and in fact you shouldn't do that, because the work that we do now is it's not pushing a plow. It's a lot more creative and necessary and inspirational. So I think this is it's been a fascinating sort of conversation, Katherine. And I know women have a really hard time. I see my spouse going through this and trying to negotiate various things. That worth conversation. I remember, I think you and Kwame talking about that sort of getting sort of assessment of your strengths and who you are. In understanding that first, and the establishing of that value helps then in negotiating value, right? So if you don't know how much you're worth or why you're worth what you're worth, then it becomes sort of a you're negotiating with sort of a couple of hands tied behind your back, as opposed to sort of being armed with like hey, look, I know I'm good. Compared to this or that to the other thing, I'm at market, above market, or whatever, right? So I think I think doing that is a good exercise, and it's good advice. Karthika, any last questions for Katherine and thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I mean, just in general, and this is something I've learned through super just falling flat on my face so many times, is that I figured out over time what my hard boundaries are, which I absolutely will not cross. And I've developed the confidence to say, yeah, that's a no. Like I'm not crossing that one. Like, not for you, not for the company, not for the greater good, not for everything. That's my boundary. I'm not crossing it. And I think working with a coach has also helped, because she helped me see the differences between, being able to have the boundaries, but deciding when to take it down and when to put it back up again, and what's fluid and what's not, kind of thing. So all stuff I've learned, still make heaps of mistakes. I'm still terrible at negotiation. I've noticed this. But, I'm learning.
Don't say that. Do not say that. No. You are excellent at negotiation. I mean, the more you say that you're terrible at negotiation, the more that you believe it. And that's the narrative that women keep being given. We're not terrible at negotiation.
Okay.
I think she's being far too critical. She's very good at negotiation. I tell her to negotiate everything, and now I say, no, you tell them the number. It's fine. So, yeah, she's very good at that. I think, maybe that was in the past, Karthika. You certainly are not now. So,
let's hope so.
Yeah. So, thanks again, Katherine. I mean, it's been a fabulous conversation, and I hope the women and men listening today, take some understand, at least from the male perspective, that they understand sort of the trials and tribulations of, when a woman does take up the courage and the confidence and comes and asks you for something, be less dismissive about it. Listen to the arguments and points put forth, and look at it from a different lens, because you just need to. I mean, that's where that's coming from. I think we've been sensitized to a lot of the diversity challenges and all that, but this gender one doesn't get maybe as much talk. At least it doesn't seem like it has, especially at the top levels of corporate companies. So anyway, I think that it's been certainly a revealing and insightful conversation to me. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Katherine. And Karthika, any passing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think, I think, like Katherine said, we should believe that we're good at negotiation.
Yeah.
Amen. All right. On that note, thank you so much again, Katherine, for joining us, and have a great rest of the week. And hopefully we'll have you back. We've shared some links to the American Negotiation Institute for where they can find some great tips and techniques, and as well as information on your podcast, which we highly recommend people listen to.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thanks. Take care.